I'm Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the week 4 of our course, and this week we'll be focusing on Kalamkari and allied practices. So by Kalamkari, what do I mean? So Kalamkari is this complex set of techniques which are sort of brought together by this term. So in Kalamkari basically we means that it is dyed, painted, printed and resist dyed cotton textiles which are mostly produced in the region of the Coromandel coast in southeastern India and also parts of Deccan, and that would be south central India, and of course the coast for Deccan is the southeastern coastline of the Indian subcontinent, and that is the Coromandel. So both in Coromandel and Deccan, in these two places there is a very specific kind of textiles, cotton textiles, which are been produced for centuries, and those are dyed, painted, resist dyed, and of course printed. So we find that in some of the textiles there are combination of combination of two or more than two kind of techniques, and in some textiles we'll find that it is exclusively either painted or dyed, or either painted or printed. So in all these cases what we find that this specific kind of this printing or painting technique and all those techniques, as I have mentioned, that all of them are brought together by this term Kalamkari. In Kalam, that means that this term, some of the early uses of these terms that we find in the Mughal Wakai or the news reports, and in which we see this term that comes to signify Kalam means pen, and then Kari means handwork mostly. Now the thing is that this particular term, if we consider that Kalamkari or Kalamkari, these terms we find them to be there in use not only in this particular region but also in Middle East, today's Iran, and part of in this network in which we find that how this particular kind of technique in which kalam or pen or some of the tools which are associated with pens or with the sharp tip like this one, so those kind of tools are used for making some kind of handwork that can either be on textile, that can also be on metal, and so on. And for all of those techniques we find that Kalamkari or Kalamzani, this kind of terms are being used. Now for our work, we'll be focusing mostly on the Kalamkari textiles which are made in the southeastern coastline and also in the mainland India, and mostly in southeastern India. So we will be looking into those particular kind of textiles. Now on screen, in the right corner of the screen, we have some of the one printed Kalamkari textile that comes from the recent times, and this is something in which we find that how printing with natural colors that is been used here. So for this precision of the printed lines that we find, and also in terms of the arrangement of the forms, and then color distribution, and then the tonal variation, all of those things that we find, and those things will be synonymous with the Kalamkari making. Now the other thing we will be looking at in Kalamkari, in this week, is the relationship between Kalamkari architecture and Deccani craft. And so as I have already mentioned that by Deccan I mean this plateau like land which we find it is almost starting from the Vindhya mountain range in which almost marks the central India, the end of the northern India, and from there towards the southern plains, and which would be covering this large area which is this plateau like area, and the western end of this plateau like area would be towards Arabian Sea, whereas the eastern end of this region would be towards the Bay of Bengal. And for our study we'll be looking either at the Deccan region, which is there at the center of this Indian peninsula, and then also towards the coastline of the Coromandel, that is the southeastern coastline. Now interestingly, even though a lot of this dye stuff and favorable condition we might consider, they have existed in the southwestern coast as well, but we do not really see flourishing of this kind of dyed, printed and painted textile making in the southwestern coast, but only in the southeastern coast. So these are some of the aspects we'll be looking at. Now then, in this region we find that with kalamkari there are many other craft forms that have flourished over time, and with a number of craft forms we can see its close correlation with this textile making, with this particular form of textile making. Now the other aspect we'll be seeing is the relationship between textile and architecture, something that we have been discussing starting with Zemper's theory on the relationship between textile, architecture, habitable spaces and our experiences. But then we'll also be seeing that, I mean, how this interrelation between textile and architecture as something that we have also discussed in the last module in terms of this intermedial transmission, that how certain kind of knowledge transmission that happens across media is something we'll be also touching upon in this week as well. Now the other aspect of kalamkari we'll be looking at, and that is its relationship to trade networks. Now in the last module we have also mentioned that, I mean, how the Mughal Empire and its complex trade networks with the various parts of the Indian subcontinent and beyond, through the sea routes as well as through the ancient Silk route, we find that, I mean, how those complicated trade networks was very much involved in shaping the visual and material culture of the Mughal era. But then for kalamkari we find a very specific kind of focus on the trade routes, and that would be mostly the oceanic trade routes. In some cases we definitely also see that how the inland trade routes would make a difference in terms of how these textiles were produced or what kind of textiles were produced for that. But the sea networks, like, I mean, the oceanic networks, the Indian Ocean Network, will find that to have been very influential in terms of how this kalamkari textiles have shaped over centuries. Now one of the other aspects we'll be looking at in this module, and that would be the artisanal perspectives into art history. Now artisanal perspective is something that we have been talking in terms of like the use of material, use of techniques and so on, and we will be taking that slightly more further in terms of understanding that if we are considering some of the interviews with the artisans, or like understanding that what are their point of view when we sort of consider this complex history of these textiles, and is it important for us to recognize these aspects of suppressed histories, and what do we get out of them. So these are kind of the questions we'll be focusing on, and also will be sort of going through in this module. And with that, let us get started with the visuals. So the first segment, as you have already seen, that we will be talking about the dyed, painted, printed and resist dyed cottons of Coromandel. And by that, what do I mean? So I'll start by looking into the painted and dyed cottons. So in the right side of the screen we have an image, and that is a detail. So as you can see that, I mean, this is around this area is then magnified into this. So one can imagine that, I mean, in this gigantic palampore or this palangposh, that also means a bedspread. So that is how, like, I mean, this particular English word came into being from palangposh or bedspread. And so in this one, this gigantic palangposh, or which can also be used as a hanging, in this one what we see that incredible amount of details are being drawn onto it. And here what we see that there are those meticulous lines which are being drawn, and that sort of, like, I mean, specify the contours of each and every element that is presented here. So we see that each and every element that is there on this textile, those are very clearly drawn, so that, I mean, the area between one element and the other area, I mean, one element with the other, is very clearly distinguished from one another. Now with that, what we also see that, I mean, after drawing these outlines, each and every element would have one outline. And then, like, I mean, then we see that there are also colors which are used in there. And in terms of like, we can see that there are hints of tonal variations, and there are also, we find that what kind of like the color, the choice of color that has been utilized. So for example, if we see this figure here, this woman who's perhaps carrying animals, something we find that in this figure, and it's a very characteristic figure. We also find this pose which is used for depicting naikas in the, or the heroines, in many other visual forms in the early modern period and so on. And in this one, what we see that there is this clear sense of the tonal variation. In the body, we see this pale red tone which sort of like marks the, or sort of like gives us a sense of what can be the color of the body. But then we find that towards the edges of where the contour line is, we find that there is also tones of like slightly darker red, and then the darker red sort of concludes in the outline which is drawn around the body. So this is how we find that at least 3 tones are used and to sort of like mark the body. And even though these bodies and then most of the forms that we see here are predominantly two-dimensional, but this slight hint of this tonal variation also sort of suggests that there is a tendency towards making them three-dimensional or bringing them closer to life. So this kind of activities that also show us that what kind of colors were very carefully selected and used in this kind of textiles. And then if we sort of like go into the larger textile here, and in this one we find that there are those colors like this slight variations in red, and perhaps in some places we see purple, and purple is achieved by overlapping red and indigo. And then we also see that how some of the other colors perhaps they have came as offshoot of mixing this color. So in one hand we do not really see that a range of color is used. For example, it's not really too many shades of yellow, too many shades of green or anything else, but it is perhaps like red, pale red, blood red, then brown, then perhaps like in blue, which is made with indigo, we find that pale blue is used, then like slightly darker blue is used, and that is how like this overall tonal variation, what we see in these images, are achieved. So this is one of the things that we find that why this kind of like this scheme, the color scheme that is used here, it also sort of contributes to the overall aesthetic sense of it. Of course it also comes from that what kind of natural dyes were obtained by these dyers. However, we'll find that the dyers also had access to many different natural dyes. It's not just like this particular set of dyes, but this is a conscious choice either dictated by the patron or also like by their choice of sort of implementing these colors on this particular way. So with this, what we see that all the color variation, then this linear rhythm, and then of course this linearity, all those things, they come forward very prominently in this Kalamkari textiles. Now the other aspect we also need to remember that all these textiles are predominantly utilitarian. They are not really meant to be displayed as paintings on the wall, but they are meant to be used. So that's the reason what we see that all these textiles, those are there made with dyes, and I'll come to the little more detail of the dyeing process later on. But then what happens that these textiles are washed multiple times, and that's the reason what we see that how these textiles can be used by people, and those are either used as wet spread, as I have already mentioned, and even if they are as hanging on the wall, one can wash them and one can put them up on the wall again. So this kind of provisions we find these textiles would provide their users or their viewers or audience. Now getting little more into this technique that what we mean by like this hand drawn technique of Kalamkari, right? For example, if we see this entire image, and as I have mentioned that all the contour lines that we see in this image, and how the contour lines also like separate one element from the other, all of them are hand drawn. So this is one of the images from contemporary Kalamkari workshop in Sri Kalahasti, and in this one what we see that the artisan literally sits on the top of this sari which is being made in this kalamkari technique and draws on the top of it, and then there is no problem about it because we know that this sari, after this black color or kasim, this color is applied on the top of it, it will eventually be then sort of washed and boiled in other dye stuff. So there is no problem in terms of like sitting on the top of it or like putting it on the ground and work on it. So it does not really require certain kind of precautions that we see perhaps in making paintings, even though the use of lines or like the overall aesthetics that we see in these images, that might come very close to painted images. But this is the difference, that since it is made in dyes, they can be washed, and then like of course that the way of making it, the way of using it, that becomes very different in these cases. Now the other aspect of kalamkari making we will find, and that has to do with printing. And as I have mentioned that with kalamkari, what we see there is that there is already some of those aspects in terms of how it is painted, how it is printed and so on. But even before painting and printing, we also need to understand that there are some of the other aspects of making those associated with it. So for example, that the weavers who would be making this kind of the fabrics which are used in kalamkari technique. So we today predominantly we find that the kind of coarse cotton that is used, and of course like also finer cotton is also used for printing, but the coarse cotton that is used, that is called gada. And then in this one we do not really see that much details are being drawn. It is just plain woven cotton in which like the warp and the weft are just unbleached cotton yarn that is used for making this plain woven cotton. And once this cotton textiles are made, and then they also go through a lot of processes, and in some of them would be like the engagement of the washer people would be very important, even though like we do not really acknowledge them as part of like understanding this complex history of this textiles. But then washing is a very important part of making this dyed textiles, like not only just this kalamkari textiles, but any kind of dyed textiles, like washing remains very crucial. And the washing can also include not only just washing and washing with soap or soap nut in a riverbank or in the local water body, but it might also include like several stages of boiling, and boiling with like calcium carbonate or similar kind of stuff which are also called as soda ash, for taking out all the impurities from the fabric. And this kind of issues we will find that why these are important is because if the impurities stay on the textile, then it might also affect the kind of like the dye absorption that the textile would sort of be used for. Now this is also something we need to understand, that this is a very different kind of technique that we are addressing here in this module, and which is different from the textiles that we have discussed so far. Because in the other in the earlier modules we find that how some of the textiles, like for example the brocades, the carpets and so on, in those ones we have the dyed yarn already there, or dyed or undyed yarn, and then like those yarns would be used with either like warp, if there is already like warp and weft, then like the extra weft would be used with this dyed yarn, or like even for warp and weft we find that how dyed yarn is used. In those cases we do not have a plain fabric and on the top of that one is applying the dyes, but it is already dyed, the yarn, and then it is incorporated in the process of weaving. So in this case what happens, that we already have this plain fabric which is almost like a surface on which like one can start doing painting. So it's a very different way of like approaching textile. It's a very different way of perhaps executing this kind of works. Now what happens with the woodblock printing, in this one we find that it's not just about the engagement of the printers, but we need to also consider that for printing there is a requirement for wooden blocks, and these wooden blocks are also something that we find those are made by this professional block makers. So we see them that, I mean, in the Deccan region and also part of northern Coromandel, extensively wooden blocks are made. I mean, of course, in the history we find that, I mean, in southern Coromandel as well, that, I mean, this wood blocks were produced, and mostly we find that the seasoned wood block, like, I mean, seasoned wood, like, I mean, teak and similar sort of woods are used for making these wood blocks, and then they are meticulously carved by these professional block carvers, and once those are carved, we find that to have been used by the printers and dyers for printing on the top of textiles. Now here we also find this notion of a template. That's something I have already mentioned when we are talking about the brocade, in terms of, like, I mean, jala or a template, or, like, I mean, when there is a use of punch cards in a brocade making, we find that, I mean, how one particular motif is created and then that is repeated all across in the textiles. Something, if we remember that, I mean, how the baluchari or like the baluchar saris, those are being made, that, I mean, each and those figurative motifs, we will see them within a particular image area, and then that image area is repeated multiple times in the sari, in mostly in the achal or pallu, and that is how, like, I mean, the use of template is sort of like put forward in this making of these textiles. Now in this case, what happens, the wood block itself that becomes a template, and then it is sort of like, I mean, pressed against a printing pad, and then from there it sort of absorbs only like a limited amount of dye, and then it is pressed onto the fabric surface for printing on the top of it. So in the left side of the screen we have an image from the workshop of the late master dyer Mukantishwara Rao from Polavaram, and in this one what we see that, I mean, a printer is making use of a wood block that we see here and using it for printing on the top of a textile, and this particular kind of textile that we see it there is called Mehrab textiles, one very celebrated textile from the region of Machilipatnam. Now in the right side of the screen what we see, this is a hanging which is called as a hanging, but I mean it also has this same kind of compositional arrangement of this Mehrab textiles if you see it here. So in this one what we have, that there again, like, I mean, we find that the central image area, if we consider it here, it is sort of like, I mean, framed within this elaborate set of borders, and the borders they run in beneath the image area and also by the sides. Now what we see that, I mean, in the here there seems to be a continuous border in this beneath this image area here, the bottom border, and then, like, I mean, the rest of the borders seem to be sort of like, I mean, encompassing the image area within it, and that suggests that, I mean, this whatever this hanging that we have on screen is not something that is just an individual piece of hanging, but there is a continuation of similar kind of images in this one piece of fabric. So within one piece of fabric, if we put it like lengthwise, then one like, I mean, one after another such units would come on it, and so this is how these hangings are made. But more importantly perhaps, that, I mean, we can think that these are not primarily made as hangings, but such kind of textiles were actually made as janamas or like prayer mat, and on which, like, we find that this mats would be made in the size of one person to sit on the top of it and pray in the I mean, of course, like, I mean, the pious Muslims would be praying 5 times a day, and for that reason we find that this particular kind of this carpet like this textiles are produced. So either it is woven, like, I mean, the janamas, and in this very specific kind that we find in Machilipatnam and part of northern Coromandel, in this ones we find those are predominantly woodblock printed. Now the other issue that comes here is that, I mean, why there is a requirement for perhaps like woodblock printing. So in this case, what we see that, I mean, there are particular kind of very complex motifs which are used here, and then particular kind of motifs which are also very significant in Islam. So for example, that we have in the center stage of this image, we have this stylized cypress motif. I mean, this motif, we like, I mean, in some ways, if we have encountered it before in terms of like the Kanchipuram sarees, we find it like, I mean, how this particular motif is called manga butta or butu, and that means like, I mean, it's a butta that looks like a mango. And then like, I mean, similar kind of motif we have also seen in Baluchar sarees, which is called kalka. Now this kind of motifs we will see that, I mean, how it becomes almost like, I mean, the upper edge which slightly curvilinear is sort of removed, and then like, I mean, this the pointedness of this almost like a droplet like a structure is sort of exemplified in it. And this is something we find in the Islamic context is a stylized representation of cypress motif. So the cypress motif, cypress tree, is something that has high significance in Islam, and that's because like, I mean, how it sort of points to the sky, and in the other word it's like, I mean, stays tall, stays unnerved during like, I mean, many events. And then like, I mean, also how that sort of like, I mean, points to the sky or to the heavens, and that's the reason we find that, I mean, there are many philosophical association with this cypress motif. Now with that, what we see that, I mean, this particular kind of motifs which are also used in this textiles, and of course like, I mean, a textile which is used for prayer purpose, in those ones this kind of cypress motif comes very significant. Now the other thing we also find it here is this cusped arch gateway, something that we have already seen in the Mughal context, and this arched gateway is something we find that had also been recognized in the mihrabs of the mosques, which also marks the direction of Qibla. So these are the reasons why we see that, I mean, certain motifs are gathered on these textiles, and something we also find that, I mean, why repeating all this set of complex motifs in any other textile making might have been much harder than doing it in wood block. And that's the reason there is a relevance for particular kind of textiles like this one to be printed by wood blocks and not hand painted. We'll continue on this discussion on the use of wood block and hand painting and resist dyeing in the next lecture. Thank you.